In April 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to New Orleans. In a city that seethed with intrigue and paranoia, he was about to enter the most mysterious chapter of his short life. And the murky trail he left behind still defies a complete explanation.
How many people know who the person depicted on the screen behind me is? Who is it?
Lee Harvey Oswald.
At Southeastern Louisiana University, Professor Michael Kurtz teaches a course on the Kennedy assassination.
Depicted here, Lee Harvey Oswald.
His students explore the maze of confusing and sinister political connections that Oswald entered in New Orleans.
There are still unresolved questions about this man, Oswald. Was he a lone assassin, as the Warren Commission claimed? Was he a person who was part of a broader conspiracy, as many people claimed? Or was he simply a patsy set up to take the blame while the real people got away with it, as he himself claimed?
If there was a plot to kill President Kennedy, then it was probably hatched in New Orleans. It was here that Lee Oswald may have crossed paths with men that hated Kennedy and wanted him eliminated.
The crucial question is, was there a conspiracy? Anybody who's going to make a conspiratorial interpretation of the assassination must connect Lee Harvey Oswald to that group that they posit as these co-conspirators. If you want to posit conspiracy, you must show associations. And unfortunately, for a simple explanation, the associations cut in two directions. This is ambivalence, ambivalence, ambivalence.
If we knew more about this case, particularly the background of Lee Harvey Oswald, focusing on the 5 months he spent in New Orleans during the spring and summer 1963, I think that perhaps we could unravel the key to the mystery of the Kennedy assassination that remains as much a mystery today as it did at the time.
Oswald arrived in New Orleans alone. He had left his family behind in Texas with a friend. He soon found work as a maintenance man by hiding much about his past from his new employers at the Riley Coffee Company.
He said that he would call when he got a job. And he did, in fact, call in early May and talked to Marina, said he'd gotten a job, that he had a place for them to stay. Marina was elated, very happy, as she hung up the phone and picked up Junie and said, "Papa nas lubit, Father loves us." And then we loaded up the car the next day and drove to New Orleans.
By now, Oswald had found an apartment on Magazine Street.
It looked all right and had some old antique kind of furniture in it, and that part was kind of nice, but by evening it was very clear that it was also terribly infested with cockroaches. When they first went into the apartment, he really wanted her to be pleased, and she wasn't that pleased, and I felt his hurt in that.
At the coffee company, Oswald soon grew bored with his menial job.
Oswald hated his job as a machine greaser at the Riley Coffee Company, and every opportunity he had, he would go next door to Adrian Alba's garage. Alba had an interest that Oswald had, and that was in guns. Alba had National Rifle Association, Argosy, Nature and Hunting, different magazines that Oswald would sit and read. And in addition, Oswald tried to buy a .30-06 rifle from him. Another time he tried to buy a Japanese rifle. This was the bond they had.
Oswald had always liked guns, but Marxist politics were still his ruling passion.
No, sir, I'm not a communist, and I think that
in New Orleans, Oswald became a very visible spokesman for his ideals.
Then are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
Oswald's political hero was still Fidel Castro.
Well, of course, Americans in general have only begun to notice Cuba since the Cuban Revolution. I always always felt that Castro's Cuba was being pushed into this, to the Soviet bloc by American policy. I still feel that way.
Oswald had no sympathy for the hundreds of thousands of exiles who had fled Castro's Cuba.
There are peasants who do not like the collectivization in Cuban agriculture. They flee. They flee Cuba in boats. They flee any way they can go. And I think that the opinion and the attitude of the Cuban government to this is good riddance.
Oswald's unyielding support of Castro was unlikely to win him friends among the Cuban exiles then pouring into New Orleans. Many joined violent paramilitary groups and waged a covert war on Cuba with the support of the CIA and the White House.
I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
But after the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the exiles felt betrayed when Kennedy's support for their war began to wane. By 1963, the Cuban enclaves in New Orleans burned with hatred for the president.
It was an intriguing city at the time, and there was all these things going on with anti-Cuba, pro-Castro elements at the time.
New Orleans homicide detective L.J. Delsa was also an investigator for the House Assassinations Committee.
It was like watching a Humphrey Bogart movie at the time, sort of like a Casablanca, you know.
In the spring of 1963, Lee Oswald entered this world of plot and counterplot. That May, he wrote to America's leading pro-Castro group, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, offering to start a chapter in New Orleans. The committee discouraged him, but he ignored their advice. He began printing his own pro-Castro leaflets and phony membership cards. He asked Marina to help him disguise the fact that he was the only member of his organization.
One day, he asked her to sign a card for an organization. And she said, "You mean that organization with only one member?" And he said, didn't matter how many members it was, it needed 2 signatures. It would seem as though there were more members. And he told her she was to sign under the name A.J. Heidel. And then she asked him, "What's that name? An altered Fidel?" And he told her to shut up.
Oswald began handing out leaflets on the streets of New Orleans. He continued to exaggerate the size of his one-man chapter.
We have had members in this area for several months now. We have decided to feel out the public what they think of our organization, our aims, and for that purpose we have been distributing literature on the street.
Oswald's pro-Castro activities seemed genuine enough, but what happened next is a puzzle. In August, he approached the leader of an anti-Castro group named Carlos Bringuer.
When Oswald came to my store for the first time, he was explaining how he was against Castro, and he was asking in what way he could help us to fight against Castro. He was telling me that he had been in the Marine Corps, that he had experience in guerrilla warfare, and that he can help us in the guerrilla fight against Castro. The second time that Oswald came to my store was when he brought this guidebook from Marines. He said that this was a present for me to see if this could help me out to fight Castro.
The manual showed how to make bombs, booby traps, and how to conduct sabotage operations. Shortly before he sought out Bringuer, Oswald had written to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, claiming that one of his street demonstrations had been attacked by some Cuban exile gusanos. In fact, no such incident had occurred. But it did a few days later, when Carlos Bringuer found someone handing out pro-Castro leaflets on Canal Street.
It was the same Oswald that has been in my store a few days before, offering his service to fight against Castro. And now he was with the sign Viva Fidel and Hands Off Cuba. When he recognized me, he smiled at me, and he even tried to shake hands with me. I refused to shake hands with him, and I started insulting him and cursing him in English.
Police were called to the scene where an amateur movie maker filmed the angry Cubans as they surrounded Oswald.
At that time, I get angry, and I was approaching Oswald trying to punch him in the face. When he saw that I was approaching and he sensed my intention, he put his arm down and he said to me, "Okay, Carlos, if you want to hit me, hit me." Immediately, I realized that he wanted to appear as a victim, as a martyr.
When one of the Cubans took the pro-Castro leaflets and threw them on the ground, the police arrested Oswald and 8 Cubans for disturbing the peace. At the police station, Oswald's conduct became even more mysterious.
We advised him that the booking procedure, which was a municipal misdemeanor, that he was eligible for posting a bond of $25 in cash or getting a politician to parole him. He said he did not want either. He wanted to go to jail. We also told him that part of the booking procedure would to be that he would have to be photographed and fingerprinted, which he agreed to. He insisted almost that we fingerprint and photograph him. He seemed to want to let everyone know who he was and what he was doing. He could have avoided it very, very simply by saying, "Hey, here's my $25, let me go home."
What kind of double game was Oswald playing? One piece of evidence has continued to raise important questions about Oswald's true attitude toward Cuba and whose side he was really on.
The leaflets that Oswald hands out on Canal Street is pro-Castro leaflets, hands off Cuba, telling the government to leave it alone, let it stay communist, let Castro alone. And the return addresses that are stamped on it is 544 Camp Street.
In that same building, there is a private detective agency by a man named Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister is certainly not pro-Castro. He's an ex-FBI agent from New York who is a violently anti-Castro and working to overthrow Castro.
But according to one of Bannister's secretaries, Delphine Roberts, Lee Oswald worked with Guy Bannister in 1963 and was given an office in the Camp Street building to mount his pro-Castro campaign.
It's when the news accounts from Dallas were showing Oswald that Delphine said to me, "Well, you know, he was in this office, you saw him." And I told her that not to my knowledge. I didn't know that I had seen him. To me, he would have been just another face in the crowd. And she was just calling my attention to the news in Dallas that this man had been in our office.
Joe Newborough is a private detective who worked with Guy Bannister.
The new building over here is where 544 Camp Street was. This was Bannister's office. This was Mancuso's restaurant. This is 544 Camp Street. And this window here is where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly had an office.
Newborough thinks the Camp Street address on Oswald's leaflet proves nothing, because Bannister's office was on Lafayette Street, around the corner.
Absolutely, you could not find yourself in Bannister's office if you went through the entrance at 544 Camp. It went strictly to the second floor of the building. There was no stairwell down. You had to exit the second floor to the sidewalk, walk around the corner, and go into Bannister's office.
So they had separate entrances?
Totally separate entrances, and probably 60 steps apart.
But new witnesses to an Oswald Bannister connection continue to come forward, including Professor Michael Kurtz.
Yes, I saw them once in the Mancuso's restaurant on the ground floor of the infamous 544 Camp Street building. This is sometime during the summer of 1963. I went across the street to get a cup of coffee, and which I did, and there were Bannister and Oswald sitting together at a table chatting with each other.
It was strange company for the Lee Harvey Oswald portrayed by the Warren Commission as a Marxist, a Leninist, a pro-Castro individual to be seen in the company of an extreme right-wing individual like Guy Bannister.
Guy Bannister was actively involved in the secret training of Cuban exiles. One of Bannister's comrades in the fight against Castro was a former airline pilot named David Ferry.
He was a brilliant flyer. He'd flown in and out of Cuba before and after the Bay of Pigs, taking guerrillas in, extracting them after operations. He was heard to say sometime after the Bay of Pigs that President Kennedy had betrayed the nation in his conduct of that operation. And he said on one occasion that the president ought to be shot. And later, some people would come to think that he meant it.
In the 1950s, David Ferry commanded a squadron in the Civil Air Patrol, but was suspended for indoctrinating the young cadets with his anti-communist views. In the 50s, Lee Oswald was in the CAP, and several fellow cadets said David Ferry was one of Oswald's instructors.
There are some clues to suggest that Oswald and Ferry's paths crossed again in the summer of 1963. Most persuasive of all, perhaps, were the group of people, completely independent witnesses, who said that a car arrived one day in the little town of Clinton outside New Orleans, and that 3 white men were in it. One of them was Oswald, who most oddly got out of the car, the only white face to line up in a long line of blacks waiting to register to vote. Waited, stood in the line, and then eventually departed. And they said that one of the other 2 white men, one of Oswald's companions, was in fact a man who looked exactly like David Ferry. And they had no doubt later about their recognition of Ferry, because Ferry by that time looked pretty odd. He suffered from alopecia, and he wore a wig, and indeed false eyebrows, not the sort of guy you forget in a hurry.
If David Ferry was with Oswald in 1963, it could be significant because Ferry, as well as Guy Bannister, was connected to one of the major figures in organized crime.
We took very seriously the possibility that organized crime had a hand in the president's death. The FBI had illegal electronic surveillance on the major figures of organized crime. We did a survey of that surveillance. What we did find, and shockingly, is repeated conversations by these people that indicated the depth of their hatred for Kennedy, and actual discussions of they ought to be killed, they ought to be whacked.
No mobster hated the Kennedys more than Carlos Marcello, the mafia chieftain of New Orleans, a prime target of the administration's war on organized crime. In 1961, Robert Kennedy had personally ordered Marcello's arrest and deportation. The boss of New Orleans was humiliated.
Carlos Marcello talks about he speaks in Sicilian, getting the stone out of my shoe, and talking about getting a nut to kill not Bobby Kennedy, who was his nemesis, but John Kennedy, who was the man behind the nemesis.
Marcello returned to New Orleans to fight the deportation order. His attorneys hired both Guy Bannister and David Ferry as investigators in the case. For Robert Blakey, who believes the mafia was involved in the Kennedy assassination, this is the critical link.
When you find David Ferry, who is an investigator for Carlos Marcello, being a boyhood friend to Lee Harvey Oswald, and with him that summer, and with Carlos Marcello at that very point in time, you have an immediate connection between a man who had the motive, opportunity, and means to kill Kennedy and the man who killed Kennedy.
I think what many conspiracy critics do is they try to take the chain, the connections, too far back. They say Oswald knew Ferry, and Ferry did some investigative work for Marcello, and Bannister did some investigative work for Marcello. Marcello hated Kennedy, and therefore it must have been Marcello deciding to kill Kennedy, down to Ferry and Bannister, who then gave the order to Oswald, who went off and did it. It's wonderful speculation. There's just no evidence to back it up.
Gerald Posner disputes all the sightings of Oswald and Ferry. in the Civil Air Patrol and in 1963. He points out there has never been any hard documentary evidence linking the two men.
I discovered documents that were from the Civil Air Patrol, which show that David Ferrie was suspended from the CAP in 1954 and not reinstated until 1958. He wasn't even in the patrol in 1955 when Oswald was a member.
Frontline has uncovered the first hard evidence that places Oswald and Ferrie together. This photograph taken in 1955 at a CAP barbecue. John Cirivolo and Tony Eisenhofer were in the CAP with Lee Oswald.
This is several cadets, including Oswald on the end in the white T-shirt, myself standing in front of him, and over here in the white T-shirt and the helmet is Dave Ferrie.
Because of all of the publicity, you can recognize Ferrie, you can recognize Oswald. They were both in the CAP at the same time. They were both wearing CAP uniforms.
After the Kennedy assassination, David Ferrie denied that he ever knew Lee Oswald.
I never heard David Ferrie mention Lee Harvey Oswald. I never met him. I would certainly remember if I ever did.
Leighton Martins was also a CAP cadet. He stayed friendly with Ferrie until his death in 1967.
And it does appear as though David Ferrie is in the picture, and on the other end of the picture there is a person who looks like Lee Harvey Oswald. It would indicate that there could be a possibility of an association, but if and to what extent, it's another question. Of course, we've all been photographed with people, and we could be presented with photographs later and asked, well, do you know this person? Obviously you must, because you were photographed with them, to which we'd have to answer, well, no, it's just a photograph, and I don't know that person. It's just someone who happened to be in the picture. So, but it's interesting.
The shame of this thing is that the whole question of Oswald's activity in New Orleans was never properly investigated by officialdom at the beginning. Guy Bannister, the former FBI agent at 544 Camp Street, was never, ever asked by anybody about Lee Harvey Oswald. David Ferrie was questioned, but the investigation was dropped very quickly, and the names of neither Bannister nor Ferrie are in the Warren report. Simply doesn't mention either of them.
If Oswald did have a secret connection to Ferrie and Bannister in 1963, the nature of that relationship remains unclear. And that evidence must be weighed against the rest of what is known of his time in New Orleans, where Oswald continued to demonstrate for Castro.
Well, I think if we take Oswald at the simplest level, what we see he's trying to do is enhance his credentials as a supporter of Castro. One of the ways he's trying to do this is actually work for Castro. Another way, he's trying to find out information that would be of use to Castro, and the normal way you find out information is you join the enemy.
That summer, Oswald wrote an account of his political activity in New Orleans, stressing his credentials as a Marxist, street agitator, and an organizer. In this resume, he wrote that he had infiltrated Carlos Bringuer's organization. When Oswald and the Cubans appeared in court for disturbing the peace over the leafleting incident, Bringuer was determined to find out more about the young American.
A friend of mine went to Oswald's house, and he was telling Oswald that he was for Castro. Then they start talking over there, and in the meantime, Oswald Child came out, and Marina came after that, and they start talking in Russian. That is when we learned that Oswald was speaking Russian. My friend asked Oswald if that was Russian, where he had learned Russian. Oswald's answer was that he was attending Tulane University, taking Russian studies.
A lie.
And that is a lie. He was a liar. He lied a lot in his life.
These are officials of INCA, the Information Council of the Americas.
Oswald, who had concealed his defection to Russia, was earning the attention of professional anti-communists.
Ed Butler, who conceived and initiated the organization. As executive vice president, he is in charge of the INCA program and engages in direct personal conflict with communism.
When Ed Butler and Carlos Bringuer were invited to debate Oswald on a local radio show, Butler did some background research.
We found out after I had accepted the interview about Oswald's defection to Russia. The information came from the House Un-American Activities Committee files. They sent me the material, I requested it, and they sent it.
Where did they get it from?
They got it from the newspapers, the open press. That's basically what they sent me, clippings that Oswald had defected to Russia and so forth.
Butler and Bringuer met Oswald at the studios of WDSU Radio.
Before the debate, we were talking over there for about 15 minutes. And as he saw my guidebook, the guidebook for Marine that he had left for me, he said to me, Carlos, please don't use that guidebook because it's obsolete. You're going to get killed.
And now back to conversation carte blanche. Here again, Bill Slatter.
Mr. Oswald, as you might imagine, is on the hot seat tonight, and I believe...
After the assassination, the debate was reenacted on film, using the original sound recording of Oswald's voice.
Are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that
Oswald seemed unaware that his opponents knew all about his defection to Russia. He was about to be ambushed.
Mr. Butler brought some newspaper clippings to my attention. You did live in Russia for 3 years?
That is correct, and I think those, the fact that I did live for a time in the Soviet Union gives me excellent qualifications to repudiate charges that Cuba and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is communist controlled.
I think he was surprised, but again, he handled it, if you listen to the debate, very coolly, and it impeached his credibility. And yet he managed to turn it to his advantage, which is, I think, shows some aplomb, certainly a lot more than most people give him credit for.
I would like to know, is it Fair Play for Cuba Committee or Fair Play for Russia Committee?
Well, that is, of course, very provocative and question. I don't think it requires an answer.
Oh, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist-run organization?
We have been investigated from several points of view. That is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, aversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
He was angry that it has been discovered that he had tried to defect to the Soviet Union, and he had been exposed in the debate. And that I could still see his face becoming red and redder and redder.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt. Our time is almost up. Thank you very much, and good evening.
The last thing that I remember was Oswald taking out a notebook, glancing up at me and fixing me with a gaze of hatred and asking for my name and address and phone number and writing it down in the notebook, snapping it shut, looking up, and giving me that Oswald sneer. I went one way and he went the other.
That you either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point?
The debate ended Oswald's campaign for Castro on the streets of New Orleans, and he withdrew from the public stage.
Are you a Marxist?
Yes, I am a Marxist.
Mr. Butler, about
By now, he had been fired from the Riley Coffee Company, the third job he'd lost in a year, and he began spending even more time at his local library. That summer, he checked out books about the assassination of Huey Long, Mao Zedong's revolution, and John F. Kennedy. Oswald still disagreed with Kennedy on Cuba, but he seemed to like the president.
But insofar as he spoke about Kennedy, it was to praise him, and he suffered, as she did, in the summer of 1963 over the death of the Kennedy's baby. Both he and Marina took this very personally, and they thought that if the best doctors couldn't save the Kennedy's baby, then the baby they were expecting might not be born alive either. One evening, Marina came home about dusk, and she saw Lee on the screened-in porch, and he was perched on his knee with his rifle at his shoulder, and he was aiming it. She was extremely surprised at this. She hated to see him with the rifle again, but he continued to dry fire the rifle for the last part of August and the first part of September.
Marina says Lee told her he wanted to go fight for Castro, and he began hatching a scheme to hijack a plane to Havana.
He said that he would sit in the front row of the airplane cabin, she would sit in the back row with June, and at a certain point he would put a gun in the back of the pilot of the aircraft. She would stand up and keep the entire passenger contingent at bay with a pistol and speak to them, and she would speak to the crowd and tell them to be quiet. Marina laughed at him and said, "Well, but I don't speak English. How am I going to explain to them?" Eventually she laughed him out of the skyjacking plan, and he came home one day and said, "Mama, I found a legal way. Go to Mexico."
On September 25th, Oswald disappeared from New Orleans. Where he was that night is still one of the intriguing mysteries of his life. There is testimony that sometime between 7 and 10 p.m., he made a call to a leader of the Socialist Labor Party in Houston. The Warren Commission believed Oswald took a bus from New Orleans to Houston, but there are no records to confirm that conclusion. Meanwhile, more than 200 miles away in Dallas, 3 men, 2 Latins and an American, showed up unexpectedly at the doorstep of 3 young Cuban exiles whose father headed an anti-Castro organization. Sylvia and Annie Odio granted Frontline this rare interview.
One night I opened the door for 3 men that came to see one of my sisters. I opened the door, they were in a small hallway with bright lights overhead.
The taller man introduced the other 2 men. Leopoldo, he said that was his name. He introduced the American who was in the middle as Leon Oswald, and he introduced the one that seemed Mexican and spoke with a Mexican accent as Angelo.
And are you quite clear about it, that when those men visited your apartment, the American was introduced as Oswald?
The American was introduced as Leon Oswald. That would always be in my mind very clearly.
According to the Odio sisters, Leon Oswald said nothing, as Leopoldo and Angelo asked for help raising money for the anti-Castro cause. Suspicious, the Odio sisters declined, and a half hour later the 3 men drove away.
I think it was 2 days after that, Leopoldo, who had clearly a Cuban accent, called me on the phone, and he tried to be very friendly on the phone with me and was trying to sell me the idea of the American. The first thing that he asked was, what did you think of the American? And actually I had not formed any opinion of the American at the time. He said, well, you know, he is, we don't know what to make of him. He's kind of loco. He's been telling us that the Cubans should have murdered or should have assassinated President Kennedy right after the Bay of Pigs, and they didn't have any guts to do it. They should do it. And it was a very easy thing to do at the time.
But author Gerald Posner believes Sylvia Odio is mistaken about the date on which the 3 men appeared at her door.
It's physically impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have been at the Odio residence on the days that she describes. She says that he was either there on the 26th or 27th of September, a Thursday or Friday, maybe at the very earliest, Wednesday the 25th.
The reason that I remember so clearly was because that same night, or I think either that night or the night afterwards, I wrote my father. And I also told a friend of mine who was my father confessor about the visit.
Odio talked to Father Walter McCann after the phone call from Leopoldo.
I think I can pin a date to this conversation with Sylvia. It was the day in which I spoke to her about her attending a charity event at which Janet Leigh was going to appear in Dallas.
If Father McCann is correct about Janet Leigh, then the three men must have visited the Odios 2 days earlier on September 25th, the only night Oswald could possibly have been in Dallas.
They were trying to sell me the American because they spoke that he was a marksman, that he had been an ex-Marine, and that he was someone who could be used and who could be an asset to any organization.
Leopoldo and Angelo have never been identified, and the meaning of this incident remains elusive. If Oswald was there, was he infiltrating another anti-Castro group, or was someone setting him up to take the blame for the Kennedy assassination? Lee Oswald is next seen the following day, alone on a bus heading south from Houston to Mexico City. On the bus were two young Australian women.
It was on the bus to Mexico City that we encountered Lee Oswald.
He heard us speaking English and wanted to talk to us. And so we talked about our travels, and he told us that he'd been to Russia. He went then and got his passport and showed us the Russian stamp on his passport.
In Mexico City, as he had in Helsinki 4 years earlier, Oswald would try to engineer another defection. Not far from the bus station, he checked into the Hotel Comercio. He took a cheap room on the 4th floor. He had brought with him a file on his pro-Castro activity in New Orleans. It contained letters from the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, newspaper articles, his handwritten biography, and the pamphlets and phony membership cards he had printed. The day he arrived in Mexico City, Oswald left the hotel and made his way to the Cuban consulate, where he was met by a Mexican employee named Sylvia Duran.
Well, it was near lunch hour, and he came and he asked for an application for going to Cuba. But I remember that he was traveling with all his papers that demonstrate that he was a friend of the Cuban Revolution. And he showed me his card belonging to the Fair Play for Cuba.
Duran told Oswald he could get into Cuba only on a temporary visa, and only if he were in transit to Russia. So Oswald walked 2 blocks to the Soviet diplomatic compound. That summer, the Oswalds had been trying to be readmitted to the Soviet Union. Lee planned to travel through Cuba and then meet Marina in Russia. At the Soviet embassy, he met with 3 consular officials. They were, in fact, all KGB officers. In their first interview, they claimed it was just happenstance that they were present when Oswald showed up.
We all thought the man had an unstable nervous system. He was extremely agitated.
During our talk, Oswald kept feeling in his pockets, taking out all sorts of papers. Then he took out a gun and put it in front of him. I sat opposite him, I took the gun away and put it on Pavel's desk. Pavel Antonovich asked him, "Why did you come here with a gun? What do you need a gun for?" He said, "I'm afraid of the FBI. I'm being persecuted. I need a gun to protect myself, for my personal safety." That's what he said.
Oswald was told it would take several months to get a Soviet visa, but without one, he would be unable to go to Cuba. Oswald took the news badly.
Well, then I explained, and then he got in that moment, he couldn't believe what I was saying, and he said, "But that's impossible. I have to go to Cuba right now because I only have a permission of 3 or 4 days in Mexico City, So I have to go. I thought that in a moment or he will be crying because his eyes, he was very excited, he was very red, and his eyes is like with bright, shining, like he was in tears. So, and he didn't want to understand. And so I called the Consul Asque.
Duran says Oswald lost his temper with Consul Asque.
Then Asque says, listen, get out. Get out. And he went to the door that it was locked. He opened and he said, get out. And if I see you again, if you come again, I'm going to kick you out.
As Oswald left the Cuban and Soviet embassies, he was being watched. These photographs taken by Cuban intelligence show the CIA operatives at work. From a house across the road from the Cuban consulate, the CIA maintained a continuous photographic surveillance. Here, a telephoto lens can be seen poking through the blinds.
It's my recollection that at the time of Oswald's presence in Mexico City, there was something wrong with some of the cameras that we were using. We were trying to fix it. But the fact remains that there are no photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald taken while he was in Mexico City at that time, and I can't explain 100% why not.
But the declassified report on Oswald's Mexico City trip, written by the House Assassinations Committee, tells a different story.
And we now find that there were several former CIA officers who said that there had been such a photograph. One of them said that he'd seen it and described it in detail, a profile shot of Oswald at the gate, another one taken from behind as he went in.
And the CIA station chief in Mexico City, the late Win Scott, in his memoirs, also said the CIA took pictures of Oswald.
Persons watching these embassies photographed Oswald as he entered and left and clocked the time spent on each visit.
That's fine for Win Scott to say, but he has no evidence to demonstrate it. And he couldn't produce the photograph, so what is he talking about?
CIA wiretaps and bugs also recorded several of Oswald's conversations inside the embassies. The CIA has always maintained those tapes were routinely erased before the Kennedy assassination.
Just done in the normal course of business, that after the tapes had been transcribed and the material was put on paper, then the tapes were routinely erased and used again.
But again, this claim is contradicted. A high-ranking CIA officer in the Mexico City embassy told Frontline the Oswald tapes existed months after the assassination, when they were played for 2 Warren Commission lawyers.
My best recollection is they offered to us to listen. They said to us, it was Win Scott, that would you like to listen to the tapes of this particular one? I can't remember now whether it was a wiretap or a bug. And Bill and I thought about it a minute and said, well, what do they like? And so they played a little bit of it for us.
Slauson says the tape was of poor quality and difficult to understand. He could not identify Oswald's voice.
Now, there were many bugs and many wiretaps, so it could be that the one that we were offered to the opportunity to listen to was the only one that hadn't been destroyed. Now, even that, just one not having been destroyed, would show that Mr. Helms' statement was incorrect.
Where then are the tapes? And the question that arises here is, why is the CIA reluctant for us to see the photographs and reluctant for us to see the tapes, to hear the tapes of Oswald's voice? While they refuse to come clean, clearly there's going to be a suspicion that the tapes or the photographs don't show what one would expect them to.
The CIA did release a photograph to the FBI on the day Kennedy was shot. They said it was Oswald entering the Soviet embassy. The agency soon realized its mistake, but the absence of photos of Oswald has fueled speculation.
The suspicion was that Oswald didn't make it at all, that there was an imposter attempting to frame him in Mexico City. Had that been established, it would indicate a sophisticated effort to frame Oswald, which would immediately draw attention to American intelligence.
But there is much evidence that the real Oswald was in Mexico City. At the Soviet embassy, all 3 KGB officers told Frontline the man they met was the real Lee Harvey Oswald, not the man in the photograph the CIA released.
Нет, это совершенно другой человек.
No, this is a completely different person. The Oswald who had visited our embassy and whose photographs I saw in many newspapers and on TV was completely different.
The day after the assassination, in the Mexican newspapers were a photo of Oswald. And I said to my husband, I'm sure that this is the man who went to ask for a visa. So I went to the embassy and I looked up the applications and I saw his application and it was the same one.
We obtained from the Cuban officials the visa application with his photograph on it and his signature. We verified that it was Oswald's signature. Oswald, therefore, was in Mexico City.
And records at the Hotel Comercio show the real Oswald was here, too. The handwriting on the register is his. Oswald stayed in Mexico City 4 days. But in the end, both the Russians and the Cubans rejected him. All his plans to fight for Castro and return to Russia had come to nothing. He had nowhere to go but back to America. In the early hours of an October morning, Oswald boarded a bus heading north. A fellow passenger remembers him, sitting alone.
Mostly he just leaned against the window, quiet, thoughtful, didn't speak to anyone. To me he seemed obsessed, fixated on one idea.
On October 2nd, Oswald crossed the U.S. border, bound for Dallas.